Hello, welcome to the webinar, How to Capture Exceptional Value from Transformational Innovation. My name is Naveen Krishnamurthy, SVP of Executive Partners here at Lux Research, and I'll be co-presenting today's session. Joining me for this discussion is my colleague Ari von Berkel, Chief Product Officer at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any time you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Now let's jump into the presentation. So really, what's front of mind for you? Just about every Lux client wants to know how to deal with what's going on in Washington, D.C. these days. So we ask the question, can industry take the next 80 odd days to think about how it wants to continue growing now and beyond? And we want to share a few examples today of how companies have been thinking about creating value for their customers and in return, changing the game somewhat so it benefits these companies relative to their competitors. And what follows has charts and frameworks. So if you're planning to listen to this webinar like a podcast, you may not be extracting optimal value. And indeed, industries are facing unique headwinds today, aren't they? And some companies are struggling more than others. Bankruptcy filings in the US are approaching levels not seen since the great financial recession, and they're only going to be exacerbated by trade barriers, especially in consumer-facing industries, but also in many other mature industries that really rely upon invention. The kind of innovation that comes from corporate research, academic research, government research laboratories. No wonder then that Lux has been hearing voices like these in our conversations with clients. And when you think about it, the debate really is not about whether companies need to continue to pursue the premium customer segment or the value-oriented consumer, whether or not to pursue net zero goals, whether or not to engage the startup ecosystem where speed and agility is the key, and whether or not to incorporate AI within R&D. At the end of the day, it's really about how can companies generate revenues and margins, isn't it? How can they make these things bigger, revenues and margins? And what is revenue? It's an accounting of the price that the market is willing to pay for the value that your products and services deliver. And so there's a similarity to this idea of price and the idea of value, but these two things are indeed distinct. And today we're going to use pricing in our discussion, but the thread we're really pulling on is that of value extraction to even perhaps create unfair competitive advantage by some companies. And so what is value? Well, for an activist investor, value might mean a great company in many respects that now has an opportunity to make some strategic course corrections to regain its luster with shareholders. In a similar vein, for any public equity investor, value investing is a style that invokes, these romantic notions of a diamond in the rough, a company with steady revenues and an underappreciated stock. It is often contrasted with growth investing. For a private equity investor, like a venture capital fund, value investing is often spoken of in the same breath as valuation of a startup that an investor is considering investing in, based on, among a number of factors like the total addressable market size and the share of that market that this startup that they're evaluating might be reasonably able to capture. For a tech scout, corporate innovation team, value might be about credible technologies that the external ecosystem is able to offer that can then be turned into new revenues for this tech scout's employer. A head of R&D might measure value based on how prolific the upper quartile, let's say, of his or her corporate lab employees are in generating patents that address unmet needs in the marketplace. Putting all of these together, Let's say you have company A, which creates new value for its customers by addressing things like convenience, safety, performance, or other attributes within a large total addressable market TAM, and eventually controls a reasonable market share in that TAM. Well, for especially transformational innovation, that TAM and the associated market share can be farther out into the future. More likely, Company A only generates a small amount of value in its first year of introducing this innovative product. But by then, the company has already invested some resources of its own, both in lab scale research as well as in scouting the landscape for complementary or competing technologies. So this conventional way of creating value to drive revenues is all well and good, but the question is, can company A also generate increasing market share without having to expend that much on R&D? In other words, while creating value for its customer, company A could also capture untapped value from that customer in lockstep. Clearly a Goldilocks scenario, we agree. And in each industry, for each market, the slope of this vector may lean more to the left or more to the right. One industry that has been thinking about this is airlines. Now, here's an industry that is one of the most challenged out there when it comes to maintaining sustained and growing profitability. It's an industry where air carriers have been long able to hold on to passengers with the promise of much later delivering unique benefits as part of loyalty programs. Well, it turns out that because miles earned by passengers have been growing faster than miles redeemed by those same passengers for airline benefits, these loyalty programs have allowed air carriers to capture more value via ticket revenue than they promised to deliver via miles redemption. This is a phenomenon that occurred not just during the lean travel years when COVID was rampant, but also is an ongoing issue, in fact. This is incidental value capture, but knowing this, United Airlines CEO came out recently and is reframing what his company is from an air carrier to really an arbitrager of loyalty that can go on to capture even more value by monetizing loyalty in several different ways. Imagine, for example, United makes Wi-Fi freely available on all of its flights this year, and then it's able to help you continue streaming your favorite Netflix show that you started watching back at the airport, recommend the right in-flight beverage or snack that goes with that TV show, and have a rideshare or taxi waiting to pick you up at the airport after you land. The point here is that this idea is coming to the fore for a lot of industries and companies, that perhaps this linear process, a very linear process indeed, of conceiving of an idea, developing a product, releasing it to market, and slowly only then generating incremental revenues is not the only way to generate revenues and margins. Well, who does this well? Selling a new product as a loss leader has within it the hope of a future value capture, isn't it? And nimble companies like some startups seem to do it well. But now large chemicals and materials companies are thinking about how to boost valuation. Is it a pricing issue? Is it a loyalty issue? Is it a market targeting issue? In these instances, we think capturing, not just creating more value than they currently do, could begin to support valuation for companies like this. For some companies, AI might start opening some new paths for value capture, yes, but chief technology officers, innovation officers of large companies are wondering how much value in return they're going to have to give away to these same AI players in the bargain. So if you ask why now, really when a CFO starts asking the question, what has innovation done for the bottom line lately? And a CTO then has to look at rising costs for talent in an increasingly diminished pool for that talent. We think it may be time to look at ways to go beyond value creation and address value capture more seriously. Let's take a couple examples. The first one is going to be in consumer packaged goods, CPG, and the next is going to be in chemicals. Let's begin. Let's talk about canned mackerel. For some, canned mackerel is an occasional delicacy. For others, it's a poor substitute for fresh seafood, or maybe even a health-friendly substitute for other protein sources like red meat. Well, either way, not much has changed in fishing for mackerel. Spain and Portugal seem to be where much of mackerel is sourced, at least in the Western Hemisphere. Well, these geographies also happen to be olive growing regions, so finding olive oil to preserve mackerel is not a challenge. Canning mackerel is relatively straightforward, and once canned, mackerel can last for years and years, certainly beyond a single presidential term. And thankfully, canned seafood is not subject to excessive tariffs yet. So getting these cans from Spain to grocery stores in the United States is the very model of business as usual. And many reputable companies sell canned mackerel. And here are a few with prices normalized on a per pound basis in New York City a few days ago. It looks like extra virgin olive oil demands a higher price than virgin olive oil, and being sustainably caught demands a higher price compared to competitors. And then we run into this. Why does this brand manage to extract a price that's this high? Sure, Patagonia Provisions tells us that their fish is sustainably caught and how this brand believes that their loyal customers are activists in their food choices. But really, is natural wood smoke as value additive to the consumer's culinary experience? So as to do what? So as to add an extra 38% to their nearest priced competitor that we're willing to pay. You have to admit, the rudimentary packaging of Patagonia Provisions is canned mackerel. It's not something to get excited about. So it's perhaps not superior marketing or packaging. Patagonia Provisions ostensibly sources its fish from the same waters off the coast of Spain that the other brands do. And there's no difference in the way their cans pop. And there's certainly no fork attached with their canned mackerel with which to consume the fish. So not a convenience advantage either. And dare I say, a mackerel is a mackerel when it comes to nutritive value. The taste is slightly better, but perhaps that's because of that natural wood smoke. So what is it? What is it about this brand that makes us want to pay more? Let's look at the company behind Patagonia Provisions. And indeed, that company is Patagonia. It's the same company that provides thermal and other outerwear and gear for hiking, climbing, snowboarding, angling, and other outdoor activities. But what does canned fish have to do with Patagonia? Well, it turns out that the symbolic proximity in consumers' minds of Patagonia Provisions and premium canned fish is robust and growing. How do we know this? One of the things that we do here at Lux is to measure the maturity of an idea. An idea could be a concept of framing a belief in consumers' written and spoken articulations via a technique that we call predictive anthropology that uses our own proprietary models to get to the underlying meaning behind that idea around which consensus is developing. And that analysis tells us that while there's early consensus around this idea, and what's the idea? That of Patagonia Provisions and premium canned fish going together, with 67 million people holding on to that belief in the US alone, that in only 12 to 24 months from today, that number will likely expand to greater than 100 million, again, just in the US. Think of this 101.9 million people as your TAM, total addressable market in the United States for this belief, this idea, again, that Patagonia Provisions being associated with premium canned fish. And so what contributes to this belief? Why is Patagonia Provisions able to charge a premium for canned fish? Well, our model goes further to say that there are 6 key themes that each builds up to the answer to that question. For example, it's not just that canned fish are a convenient source of protein on the go, but also that if Patagonia Provisions offers canned fish, then in the consumer's mind, that resonates with conscious consumption. So why are these positive themes associated with Patagonia provisions? Well, Patagonia has long championed this human quest, really, for responsible ways to enjoy nature. And on the one hand, shielding us, humans, from heat and cold, while also shielding nature from the worst that humans in our nature explorations can bring about. Or at least that's what the brand has been known for. This means that when Patagonia branches from apparel to canned food, the brand associations carry over very strongly. And so this expansion into food that may seem like a non-adjacent, downright tangential market was no accident. In fact, our model illustrates that Patagonia may have been onto something when they started Patagonia Provisions many years ago. Notice how much just that one theme, convenience plus conscious consumption, this human subculture, as it were, is expected to grow from 55 million now to 82 million in 12 to 24 months in the United States. So then the question comes up, knowing that the consumer views this brand as seated firmly in this theme, as well as these 5 other themes, is it possible for Patagonia Provisions to not only continue to capture value, but also build on prior value capture by not only continuing to maintain its market share, but also grow it, and if needed, pass on potential additional costs that might arise from inflation, tariffs, or other macro factors to those same consumers and have consumers respond positively. Now, given where Patagonia Provisions sits on the maturity curve with headroom to shape consumer perceptions, this model says it's quite possible. What do you think, Ari?
Yeah, so I'd like to try and frame this in terms of assets. And by that, I don't mean that Patagonia may or may not own fishing boats or something like that, or a canning factory. In fact, I don't know if they own one. I would find it highly likely that they probably don't. They probably have toll gate production. But the fact that they're so uniquely positioned to essentially hitch a ride on this maturity curve, that's an asset. And let's explore how you can consciously use your assets to capture value, both value that you create on your own and value maybe that you can capture by looking at other developments that are happening in your general ecosystem. So maybe to elaborate on that a little bit more, there's another example here that may be worth sharing. This is a bit of an older example already. It's about the market of silicons, and the two entities that I'm going to talk about both have since ceased to exist in their current form, but that's because of other developments in the market of silicons. I'm talking about Dow Corning, who was a market leader in silicon production and mostly silicon formulation. So this is, thanks to the Wayback Machine, an image of their website around 2010, 15 years ago, and you can see they're emphasizing interaction. They're emphasizing interaction with their clients. They mentioned solve a problem here on their site, right? So they're there to help you solve a problem. They're there to help you find the perfect formulation of silicons for your particular application. So their emphasis is we help you solve a particularly difficult problem with silicons, find the perfect solution, create the formulation for you. We're with you all the way. We're supporting you. And then we have Xeameter. And Xeameter is a site that is geared towards efficiency and quick access, right? It's a web shop. This, again, is from their site in 2010. And it really is just, you can log in with your account. You may be able to get some info, but the core of the site is just, here's the price. You can get some details, and then you can quickly move on to purchasing some silicons. Now, the interesting thing is, this site makes a point of showing that it's actually another brand of Dow Corning at the time. Right? And the reason that's interesting is, and by the way, this is slightly before 2010, but there hasn't been much changes between 2003 and 2010 to the general design of this site. Right? So the reason that's interesting that they mentioned Dow Corning will become apparent. They're borrowing some of Dow Corning's assets here. On the other hand, Dow Corning is also borrowing some of Xeameter assets. So comparing the two very different business models, but explicitly by one company. One invites interaction and emphasizes expertise and innovation. The other one gets straight to business and emphasizes efficiency and speed. How do we make sense of this? How does this allow you to capture more value in the market? Now, to look at that, let's take a look at the price demand curve. And what you can see here in the picture is the green line is the classical price demand curve. Here it's multiplied by the volume. So it's the price that you can charge times the number of buyers that will buy at that price. So that's how you see that curve that first obviously starts at zero, because if 0 people are buying your product, no matter at what price, you will still have a revenue of 0, obviously. And then, of course, it goes up as more people start buying it. But then if you want to persuade even more people to buy it, then the curve goes down again because your price goes down. So you're selling at a much lower price to a much bigger group of people. And then, of course, you also have a cost curve. And cost, of course, is 0 if you produce 0. Cost will go up if you produce more. But also the cost per unit produced will go down because of a learning curve. And that's all implicit in this curve. And then finally, if you subtract the two, you get the value. So the purple curve here shows value. And what is your job as an innovator? Well, it's either to increase willingness to pay or to reduce cost. If you do either one of that or both, you can increase value, as you can see with the dotted purple curve here. So increasing willingness to pay will boost your revenue because it will raise prices. And I think right now we're in a transformational state of the market. We already were in a transformational market with the energy transition and the transition to circularity and the transition, for example, to the protein transition in the food market. So there were already quite a few transitions going on. And right now, with tariffs, for example, and with the whole debate about globalization and global trade, we're also in a transition, in a shift of how consumers want to spend their money. So the spending patterns are now also transitioning. So this is probably the best time ever. This is really a generational opportunity for you to try and increase willingness to pay. Everything's shifting. So there's a lot of opportunity to convince people to pay more for a certain type of product now. So that's your main job as an innovator, increase that willingness to pay. And in fact, I think you should evaluate your projects primarily based on that. Is it either increasing willingness to pay or reducing cost? A lot of the conversations we had in the past with people, for example, about energy transition and the effect of regulation. Regulation primarily acts on reducing cost, right? That increases cost. Innovation that makes you less vulnerable to carbon tax, that reduces cost. It doesn't really increase willingness to pay for consumers. And I think that's a missed opportunity for a lot of these things, including plastics recycling and all that. we haven't been paying enough attention to increasing willingness to pay. We've only been paying attention to reducing cost of the more sustainable alternative. And a lot of the time that there's an appeal to the government there. So how does that work out in the two examples we had? And how does that relate to assets for capturing value? Because the value that you have underneath that purple curve, that's not all yours. If you're creating the value by increasing the willingness to pay or reducing cost, it doesn't mean that you're getting the value. You will have to share that value with others. So for Patagonia, sorry, I'm trying to click here. Yes. For Patagonia, right, they increased willingness to pay. How did they do it? They increased it by creating for a certain group of customers a premium product. And Naveen just showed us what premium means in this case, and it is that pairing convenience with sustainability that Patagonia really nails. And so they increased willingness to pay, and they increased it empirically, and they increased it significantly, like 30% more, at least in the supermarkets, probably not in the wholesale business. So that's great. And are they able to also capture that value? Who is getting the value? Well, in this case, Patagonia, and Naveen and I had a discussion about it. It's not available in the supermarket in the Netherlands where I am, but Naveen tells me Patagonia doesn't even get premium shelf space in the supermarkets. So that's an indication they're capturing a lot of the value themselves. They don't need the assistance of supermarkets to sell at that higher price. So they get to the shelves, but they seemingly or ostensibly have negotiation room. So that is really interesting, and they do it because they have a brand credibility with the Patagonia apparel history, with the brand image and the credibility that this brand has. They don't need to convince everyone that it's truly sustainable. It is a given. There's implicit trust by consumers that they live up to that image. And that's an asset. And that's an asset that they built over the course of probably 25 years. So it's not a cheap asset, right? It takes a lot of investment. And in this case, a lot of time. But it pays off because they were able to transfer that brand image from the market of apparel and clothing to the market of food, which is, of course, very different, but it persists. Now, for Dow and Xameter, it is even more interesting how they create value and capture it, right? Because Dow Corning and Xameter are capturing each other's value. So Xameter manages to sell at a lower price, but also still convince people that they're buying premium silicone formulations. So they're not buying the cheap product, they're buying the good product at a low price. That's why they make a point of pointing out that Dow Corning is involved. They don't try to disrupt them. Very often when people discuss this case, they say, well, this is a company that disrupted itself. To a certain extent, yes, but on the other hand, not really. They're really trying to maintain that credibility of a premium product. On the other hand, Dow Corning benefits from the higher volume. So there's now a higher volume being sold of their product, and therefore they can reduce cost. So they're capturing part of the value that Xameter produces by increasing the volume of the product. So this is a really intricate and interesting way of using your assets, right? The asset being operation in producing and in selling, and the other asset being really customer intimacy and excellent support and knowledge of your product. So how does this work as a framework? How can you start to use it, right? Now we start by really being very clear about how you create value. And remember, you have two options. You can increase willingness to pay or reduce cost. And also remember Peter Drucker, who said, every business has two basic functions, innovation and marketing. And those are your tools. Innovation and marketing is how you can do this, how you can increase willingness to pay and or reduce cost. So those are the two instruments you need to look at. And as Lux, we support both, right? We support your innovation, your technology innovation through our research and advisory services on technology. And we also support your marketing efforts through our consumer insights research. You have to be very clear about how you create value, meaning pick just one. If you cannot resist, pick two. Don't come with a list of 5 or 6 options that all together should increase willingness to pay. That tends to be too complicated and misses the mark. If you have one simple thing like we sell mackerel, but it's a sustainable version of it that is better for nature, that is a very clear message that increases willingness to pay. If you add 4 more things, it doesn't become more powerful. It dilutes the attention because you're probably addressing different types of audiences there. So once you are clear about how you create value, then determine your position on the map. What group of people are you after? Are you after a very large market? Or are you after a niche application? Where on the horizontal axis in that chart are you aiming to get? And then you start capturing value, which means you need to map your ecosystem, right? There's a client and there's lots of things happening around the client. There's a regulator, there are suppliers in your value chain, there's someone funding, there's a manufacturer of your product, which may not be you. It could be a tollgate manufacturer. There's a retailer perhaps selling it. There are service companies involved. If, let's say you're trying to market a heat pump and capture the value of the heat pump. The value of the heat pump is you save energy compared to a gas-fired boiler. So you save energy spending, you save money on your energy costs. How do you capture that value if you're the one who invented or who produces that heat pump? Right. Well, maybe, and that's the design your value capture, maybe as a manufacturer, you team up with a funding partner and you create some sort of lease that allows you to capture part of the value in the use phase of the heat pump, because that's where the value is generated after all, right? So in your lease structure, maybe you manage to capture some of the energy savings that are otherwise captured by the consumer. Look at your ecosystem, design your value capture in there. Look at what assets do you have? Why would that funding partner want to partner with you? Maybe because you're very good at taking back the heat pump. So you can turn the heat pump into kind of a collateral to the funding partner. Maybe you're very good at servicing the heat pump. So that's why it is a good idea to be a leasing structure for that heat pump, right? But that requires that you have an asset, which is a service organization that is able to cover your entire region in which you sell, for example. So be conscious of your assets and design your value capture. Now, just to summarize, right? So when talking about value, and we've seen how Naveen has shown us that value means different things to different types of innovators and different types of investors. And how do you then capture that value? And capturing value could mean elevating the valuation of your company, or just elevating the profit margin of your company, or many other things. So you need to build assets to capture value. So be conscious of your ecosystem and plan to build those assets, and that will take a while. And those assets are not just capital assets. There are many soft assets, and they are getting increasingly important. Then use this framework in a known ecosystem. You have to design the value capture, but in order to do that, you have to know who the different actors are. If there's a completely new ecosystem, if you're in the 1970s and you're the first one trying to produce personal computers, that's a completely new ecosystem. It's very difficult to use that kind of framework that we're talking about here in that sort of situation. But in a known ecosystem, you can easily do this. And then finally, evaluate the ideas you have on innovating first and foremost on willingness, on whether it's increasing willingness to pay. That still means after that you have to do a business case, because even if willingness to pay is increased, if it then is incurring a lot more costs, it may not be that beneficial. But if you are not doing something that increases willingness to pay, or reducing cost, you're not really on a winning track for your innovation. There's no value to capture, essentially. So, and our consumer insights, some of which was shown to you by Naveen today, can help you evaluate whether you're increasing that willingness to pay. With that, Naveen, I think we've talked enough. I certainly have. And we should probably take a look if there's any questions from the audience right now.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Ari. Let me take a look. So yes, we'll now be taking questions that the audience may have on the presentation, which they can type into the questions box. If we do not get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch with you after the webinar. Ari, here's an interesting question. How long will it take for a new entrant to create and deliver value before hoping to start capturing value? What do you think?
Yeah, I was hoping you would pick that. I saw that question coming up here. So that's a very good question because it goes back to assets, right? And so you need to build those assets. So how long will it take for you to capture value? Well, first of all, the whole thing of capturing value, you need to produce the product and all that. But if we forget about that, because I think everyone will know how to operationalize that, you need to have the time to build your assets, which could be brand credibility, or it could simply be an excellent manufacturing organization, or it could be the professional services like Dow Corning was providing. So that takes time, and the main time constant there is about building the credibility. And it depends on your market, but I would say you need about 5 to 10 years before you get a credible asset in the market that will allow you to capture value. So that means you really need to look ahead and position yourself strategically with your assets. What do you really want to own? And could be for a supermarket, it could be market share. It could just be negotiation power when purchasing, right? But identify your assets, build them, and be patient, because your assets will gain strength if you make the right choices. Now, that's an interesting one, because as you're looking at your assets, and I'm looking at the Q&A here, and there's a question here which I think is a pretty good one, Naveen. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are there about the willingness to pay, right? How do you come up with those ideas to increase willingness to pay? Where do they come from? I think that's a really good question also in the light of these assets, because having a good idea about that also provides you with a good idea of what sort of assets you would need. So it all starts there. How do you get good ideas about increasing willingness to pay? So what do you say about that? How can you go about obtaining those?
Yeah, it's a good question, I must say. It's how do you obtain ideas for value creation and capture is how I think about this. So if that's where the question was going, there's a few different ways in which you can understand.
Looks like on my
gaps.
end, your audio is breaking up a little bit, Naveen. I don't know if there's...
Okay, let's try this again. Can you hear me okay, Ari? Well, let's see. Maybe it's just Ari's connection that has issues, but hopefully the audience is fully able to hear me. So I'll reframe the question. I think what I heard is, how do you obtain ideas? How do you obtain ideas for what? For value creation and value capture in the first place. There's a few different ways you can think about this. In Traditionally, the way companies have approached this, communities, governments have approached this is what is called the Delphi method, which is really to bring together a collection of subject matter experts to talk about the problem. And that problem could be a business problem, a technology problem, a communal problem, a regulatory problem. Subject matter experts that come together with one mission. Let's call it the Delphi method. Of course, there's quite a few advantages to that. That's one. We really think that in this era of uncertainty everywhere, and this idea of value capture, especially the diversity of thought that comes from deep operating experience in non-adjacent industries, these minds brought together to solve a common business challenge where the solution benefits all industry participants, is unique, where it's subject matter experts, but really operational subject matter experts with very diverse experiences. So that's another one. That's a twist to the Delphi method. And some of our clients continue to conduct ideation days. Some of the benefits of ideation days within a company is to bring those closest to the problem to come together with those who have the means to address the problem. That's one. And then I think in all of these things, we have to keep in mind that finding new ideas is really about understanding functional gaps, not necessarily product gaps. Doing so then, these functional gaps really give us an idea about unmet needs, persistent, prevalent unmet needs. And we at Lux have ways to do that. And what that does then is to refocus technology, marketing, business division leaders, right, to truly uncover and ponder the problem as opposed to falling in love with a solution too quickly. That's how I would think about this, Ari. And that brings to mind, for me at least, this other question that I'm seeing. It's a logical question. Based on your discussion, it seems like this willingness to pay or reduce cost is a dichotomy exemplified in the Xyometer case, where the Xyometer seems to have brought both of those things together for value capture. But many companies will argue with you, Ari, and say they are in commoditized or commoditizing markets. How would you advise them to undertake value capture?
Yeah, I think that's a highly relevant question. And I made a remark somewhere in the presentation that we're experiencing transformational times right now. And the transformation is on multiple aspects. But one of the transformations I think we're seeing, especially with the trend towards deglobalization and a bigger emphasis on self-sufficiency, at least on a national level, or perhaps in the case of Europe, EU level, for example. The consequence of that will be that some products are going to get more expensive. There will be a shift in spending patterns. We saw a similar shift right after COVID. So I don't know about your neighborhood, Naveen, but where I live, suddenly restaurants, for example, were struggling even after COVID when they opened up again to find clients and to find personnel. So there had been a shift in the economy towards other activities. So even if you're in a commoditized space, things are shifting right now. And there can be new attributes. Some of them are virtual that you can attach to your product that may help you increase willingness to pay. So in America, just attaching a label made in America may increase willingness to pay. Of course, it has to be credible, right? If you say it's made in America, people find out later it's made elsewhere. That would be really unfortunate, probably. So that again goes to your asset to capture value, right? If you say made in America, you have to follow through, and people have to believe that you're following through. That's your asset. That's your brand credibility. Same thing about sustainability. We saw Patagonia, right? The cans of fish that Patagonia sells in the supermarket are not that different from any other cans. So there's not a physical major difference between the products, but there is a virtual attribute, which is this fish was produced while caring for nature, while being sustainable, which increases willingness to pay. So look at those attributes, virtual or physical, and keep in mind that there's a major transformational shift happening on multiple aspects on sustainability, circularity, um, national autonomy or self sufficiency. All of these things are shifting right now in the consumer space. So look at what consumers really want and look at that as virtual attributes, and then take a close look at your assets. Are you that company that is really credible in reshoring manufacturing? That may be an asset that you can use. Not today, because you need to build the trust, maybe 3 years from now. But you can anticipate and work on that. So even if you're in a commoditized space, take a hard look at your assets. That's where you can find the differentiation and the added value.
Very well, Ari. Thank you. I know you have key takeaways on this slide, but from my personal view, 3 key takeaways that really jumped out time and again in this presentation was it's really a generational opportunity to redefine products and services and technologies that go along with realigning supply chains and customer segments. And this brings some immediacy and urgency for the kind of things that leaders can start thinking about during this macro uncertainty. That's number 1. Number 2, I think we displayed that there's this potential for value capture across industries and across commoditized or niche or premium markets. And lastly, this integration of marketing and technology insights, that is a key needed to start thinking about value capture inside and outside conventional value chains. Thanks again, Ari, and that concludes our webinar for today. This slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to attendees. After leaving this webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help us inform and improve future webinars. Take a moment to check our upcoming webinars, and thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.